Hello, Rose, and today we're going to be talking about Belonging Again, Part 20, and we've started talking about Philip Rieff, who wrote an important book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. And a lot of what this book is going to talk about is that whenever you have a social revolution, it's going to be a reorganization of the dialectical expression of yes and no, the interplay of which constitutes culture, transforming motive into conduct. And Philip Rieff is he's going to be making an argument that basically culture is ethics. And ethics, when we hear that, we can think about, simply what you shouldn't do. We can think about moral principles like love your neighbor, don't murder, and things like that. But Mr. Rieff is going to have a much more expansive understanding of the term ethic. And that's going to be not just what you cannot do, but it's also going to be guidance on what you should do. So, for example, if you're standing in line and someone is ahead of you, there's no law that says this, but you understand, there's a cultural understanding that the person ahead of you has a right to be served before you are, because they're ahead of you in line. And these sort of social norms, these sort of things that people just understand are the case, and these make social life intelligible. Without them, it would be very hard to operate in society. You would go out and always be worried if you were about to mess up. You would always be worried if you were offending someone or do something wrong. And so what ends up happening, as Philip Rieff talks about, is without a corresponding moral order comprised of symbolic boundaries, it's going to say, because there's no hard material reality telling you or forcing you to acknowledge that someone ahead of you in line should be served first, or that if they leave a coat on their seat, that therefore they've reserved the seat. You can come up with all sorts of different examples. But the social order is organized by those symbolic boundaries. And if you don't have them, what ends up happening is feeling like everyone, the language that Mr. Rieff uses, is everyone feels like they live inside of a cage. Everyone feels isolated. They feel alone because the outside world is not intelligible to them. And so they feel like they're alone with intelligibility. They don't feel like they can share it with everyone else. And even if you can go out and see other people, if there's not a shared intelligibility, and there's not a shared social intelligibility, then everyone's going to feel like they're in a cage, like an animal, like a zoo animal is what Mr. Rieff is going to talk about. Even if they're near people, even if they're in a group, everyone will feel alone. And so Mr. Rieff is going to really basically say that culture and ethics are the same thing. The system of yeses and nos, what you can do, what you cannot do. And it's not merely law. Culture is not merely law, but the norms of which are not codified into law that we all know without anyone necessarily telling them to us directly. This is why Mr. Rieff is going to say a purely therapeutic culture is an anti-culture. It is a culture that can't even be a culture. And by the triumph of the therapeutic is the release, pure release. And he wants to say that if you have just releases, if there's not any no's, then anything goes. And if anything goes, then nothing is clear. If anything goes, nothing is clear. And so you don't know how to organize yourself. And if culture is indeed the systems of permissions and restrictions of directions of what you can and can't do, well, then this is indeed an anti-culture. A culture where anything goes is not a culture. It is the loss of culture. And in the past, civilizations understood that a healthy person is, in fact, a good citizen, which would be someone who followed the social orders of yeses and nos. And so that's how you would define a healthy person. And also, that contributed to mental health. You knew what to do. You had guidance. Now, of course, this was dangerous because the system of yes and nos can be used in service of a great evil like Nazi Germany, the banality of evil. That's the risk that has. But without it, you don't have a system of organization. You don't have shared intelligibility, and that's when mental illness gets worse. That's when it becomes very hard to operate. And also it's hard to define what a successful person is or a healthy person is per se if it's no longer someone who follows the social order. The definition of a quote-unquote healthy person then becomes individual. It becomes up to a given person to decide for themselves. But of course that means that the definition of being a quote-unquote healthy person is not shared. It is not something where we become more healthy. It's not the case that if we're more healthy, we participate better in the social order and thus gain more shared intelligibility. In fact, it can be the exact opposite, where being mentally healthy and pure therapeutic is defined as being more and more atomized. So then you have this kind of mix-up of the incentives where you are incentivized to be more isolated in order to be healthy, which paradoxically leads to worse mental health, if in fact isolationism as so described contributes to worse mental health. And that is indeed what Mr. Rieff believes. is the case. So if you do not have a system of ethics, you do not have a culture. And also, too, without a system of symbolic integration, then that would mean that people don't have a system by which to manage what Lacan called the real. And the real is... you could generally put it as the difficulty of human reality, the fact that humans are hard to be with, that they constantly misunderstand one another, they constantly hurt each other, that they are confusing, that they are difficult. That is what's beneath the system of symbols that make up a society, or symbolic metaphysical direction. The real is what all of that is underneath. Now, critically, none of us can handle too much of the real too often and all at once. We need... it needs to be vented to us, like a ventilation system. It needs to be given to us gradually, in pieces, so on and so on. If it is not, then the real overwhelms us, and we get destroyed by it. So you need a system of yeses and nos to give us enough real that we're not ignoring the real, but not so much real that it overwhelms us. Well, in a purely therapeutic culture, there is not going to be a effective ventilation system of the real to help us deal with the real. So we're either going to be overly exposed to it or underly exposed to it. It's going to be completely random, and that's going to lead to mental health problems and existential instability. And when you have that existential instability, then unfortunately totalitarianism becomes appealing. Rieff believed that in a therapeutic culture, then a person with character is going to be someone who's totally and utterly free, meaning pure yes. No restriction, it's just all that they want to do. Well, that would then therefore mean that someone with character, who is quote-unquote healthy, would be someone who is most in danger of poor mental health and existential instability. So you have this very strange inversion of the good and the bad that can occur. Not because it's bad to be free, but because it's bad to be free entirely, in the same way that it is bad to be held back entirely. It's this complicated system of yeses and nos that has to be negotiated out in the lived experience of the community, where if we follow, say, Mr. Conyers again, in the doctrine of tolerance contributes to a no one should say no to anyone. Everyone should just tolerate everyone's yeses, and that's very top down from the state down. And when that occurs and the state has so much power, it's very unlikely that the a given local community is going to be able to negotiate an effective systems and yeses and nos, because whatever they negotiate, the state is going to override. And Mr. Rieff believes that they're overriding with a pure therapeutic. And if Conyers is right, then indeed the state is overriding with a pure therapeutic, and all of that is going to contribute to mental illness. Now, it's going to reduce the probability of a banality of evil, but it is also going to give rise to higher mental illness. That's at least what's likely. It should also be noted that if the society turns a lot to science, and then it's actually going to feel as if it's scientific to let there be the triumph of the therapeutic. The triumph of the therapeutic is going to get a kind of scientific feel to it, because both science does not moralize; it just tells you the fact. So science kind of contributes to this forbidding to forbid, which was a phrase that terrified Philip Rieff. The idea that society should forbid forbidding, because he knew that would lead to anarchy and horrible mental health and different things. If science also, because science cannot give you a moral code. And if you exist in a world where you think that if it's not scientific, it cannot be true, well, then that's a world where there can't be a moral code, because science can't give you a moral code, and everything has to be scientific, then nothing can have a moral code. And that, in essence, will destroy the system of symbolic integration and boundaries necessary for an effective system of ventilation so that people can handle the real. Not too much of it at once, not too little. So science can be integrated into this problem in the same way that the doctrine of tolerance can be integrated into this problem, as described throughout Belonging Again so far. So anyway, this was part 20. For more by O.G. Rose, and for the other 19 parts, please see ogrose.com, Medium, Substack, YouTube, Anchor, and thank you so much for your time.